Here we are.
Okay, I think I may actually be on now. That was
Yeah, very good. Good to see
very
you.
strange.
So I am. I need to make sure I'm managing the Facebook Live feed so that yeah, there we are. Turn that down so that we are live now. So Caroline Hamilton-Arnold is the. I'm going to try to get this right. I mess up your title almost every time. She is the Associate Director for Week of Compassion, Domestic Disaster Relief Efforts. I didn't get that right. But she is, as I say to people every time Week of Compassion is mentioned, the two of the four primary leaders of Week of Compassion are people who were raised and launched into ministry by the Christian Church in the Southwest. So very proud of them. I tell people all the time, the reach of the Christian Church in the Southwest reaches all the way around the world because of our involvement with Week of Compassion. And Caroline, you are a graduate of Texas Christian University and Pacific School of Religion.
Close, that's my husband. I went to Claremont School of Theology. So another campus with Disciple Seminary Foundation.
Yeah, right. And so we want to talk about some specific things that are relevant right now that you are involved with, but also talk generally about Week of Compassion. So tell us a little bit about Week of Compassion in general, and then specifically about what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. At risk of being overly rudimentary, Week of Compassion is the Relief, Refugee, and Development Mission Fund for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. We work with partners to alleviate suffering around the world. It's our mission statement, and I think a pretty succinct description of what we do. We help to connect disciples' resources to places of need. And those are all kinds of resources, though primarily financial as a mission fund. We also bring informational resources, like I hope I'll be able to share this evening, relational resources as we help partners strategize and think through how to approach challenges and how to dream better futures. And then those sort of intangibles that just happen when you get people in a room, and hopefully in our best moments when we're open to the movement of the Spirit, we are doing that as representatives of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. As Associate Director,
I would interject there just to say, you said primarily financial, though I will say just from personal experience, it's primarily ministerial. That you all are in ministry, and my first encounter with this kind of work was through Harvey. I started as regional minister right at the end, really as the relief efforts for Harvey were beginning to ramp up, and I can just tell you that all of us sort of hit those moments of crises like that, like during the headlights, and what you and V and others with Week of Compassion do for us is help just kind of break the cloud and say, you can do this. We're here to do this together. You're not alone. And I have seen that more than once, Caroline, that it's been Paul that's gotten me off of dead center and said, yeah, I've got a plan. I've got a way to do that. So anyway, go ahead.
Well, thank you. I had to call you into service before your official start date, and I always feel a little bad about that, but I'm grateful for the partnership. My primary role is with our domestic disaster response. So for us, domestic is the US and Canada, and I help to facilitate recovery efforts through disciple congregations and through our ecumenical partnerships. So that's connecting disciples to preparedness resources so they can be better prepared when disasters happen. It's working to and through our disciple congregations immediately following disasters, amplifying their efforts to provide relief in communities and providing relief directly to them when our members and churches have themselves been directly affected. And then connecting disciples with ongoing recovery efforts through the months and years that follow a catastrophic event.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Week of Compassion began in the 40s as disciples in America were trying to aid recovery efforts in Europe following the Second World War. And Week of Compassion really started out as simply a week in which we would collect funds for that recovery effort. And you've kind of evolved since then to become right year round. So when is the Week of Compassion historically and in terms of our calendaring? When do these congregational leaders that are going to be tuning into this conversation need to mark their calendar to actually take the Week of Compassion offering?
Well, we'll take your offering any week of the year. Officially on the denominational calendar, we are one of the designated special offerings of the General Church, and we are the end of February. We're the last 2 Sundays of February, and we usually try to start pushing out resources well in advance, knowing that folks have Advent planning, and then there's the, oh good, we made it through Advent and Christmas, and then you're halfway through January.
Yeah.
I still have to plan worship.
Well, and for many of us, Martin Luther King Day and Week of Prayer for Christian Unity is a big deal, and so yeah,
lining up in there too. So technically the end of February.
And when I was in local church, I would often say to my folk when a natural disaster occurred. I remember the tsunami that hit Japan, and people want to help, but they don't know necessarily who to trust, and you hear things about nonprofits. Honesty and credibility. And so I would always tell folk that when those natural disasters, whether they're domestic or international, when those natural disasters strike, the dollar that they can trust the most is the dollar they give the Week of Compassion. Is there some what does a church need to do if they want, let's say there is a fire in California, which we've had to deal with, right? And so they're concerned about their disciple sisters and brothers in California following a major fire like that. How do they designate, or how would a church take an offering, say in August, for that kind of need?
Sure. We have some broad designations that are always available. So one of those is U.S. storms and fires. So in that example, that would most likely be the line. There's a hurricanes line. There's a line for refugee assistance. There are several other designations that we have active. We do that intentionally because there may be a fire in one part of California that's getting all of the attention, and another fire in rural Colorado that's maybe not getting as much attention, as happened this past year. And we try to take our resources where they will make the most impact. So we don't always have specific designations for this particular fire, but it might be the 2020 fire season. That said, there are also places where we have lots of disciples or we have existing relationships, and we know we will be supporting relief efforts and long-term recovery efforts, in which case, while legally we don't set up a designation for it, we know we're going to be responding significantly, usually beyond what is donated through designated funds, to that response. Sort of a long-winded answer, but we do occasionally put up a specific designation for an event, but usually it's those broader U.S. storms, flooding, hurricane. Always, if a church puts an event in the memo line, we know where to direct it within our legal fund, and then I just keep track of where things have been designated and where we need to look for partners or find ways to connect.
Right, and so that's one way. Again, the conversations that we're having that we call CCSW Disciples Connect, is really about making sure that people so often those of us who've been disciple a long time and doing this a while, we'll say WOC rather than Week of Compassion, and we won't always go through the process of explaining everything we mean. So one way for someone in a local congregation to connect to a really vital ministry in the Disciples of Christ is to give financially to Week of Compassion. You also facilitate some volunteer work, right? And Disciples Volunteering is now a ministry of Week of Compassion or partnership. Yeah. You explain it.
Yeah. In this moment of COVID, when we had to suspend all of the volunteer teams that we had been facilitating in partnership with Disciples Volunteering, provided a moment for us to really reflect on the way that we had ministry structured, and to go deeper into some conversations we were already having. And then my colleague Josh Baird accepted a call to our partner ministry at the United Church of Christ in their Global Hope office, which is great for our ecumenical partnership, and sad for me personally, and also provided this other kind of movement and space as DHM is envisioning the job description and the role they want to fill in that absence. Week of Compassion is taking on specifically the disaster response volunteer pieces, while Disciples Volunteering will stay in ministry at DHM, and they will envision what that specifically looks like as they go through that discernment process. The disaster piece will be housed entirely within Week of Compassion, where before it kind of straddled both ministries. For local congregations, it basically doesn't change anything other than the URL you'll type in to go register your volunteer teams, which will now be on the Week of Compassion site instead of DHM.
DHM. Yeah, and by DHM we mean Disciples Home Missions, so that we can clarify our alphabet soup in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. So those are a couple of ways, right? I mean, I think we probably should have said first, even before we talked about money and about volunteer ways to be involved, just awareness that Week of Compassion is a ministry of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and it's good to make it a prayer concern and to make it a part of your discipleship to know what Week of Compassion is doing. So the URL for weekofcompassion.org, correct? Is right?
Yep, I'll spell that, weekofcompassion.org.
Okay. And so that's a place where we can get, and that's a place where we can get more information about Week of Compassion.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's
I'm getting messages that my internet is unstable. So
yeah, you got a little glitchy, but I followed. Weekofcompassion.org is our website. There's a tab on there that says stories. You can keep up to date with what we're doing. You can register there to receive our email newsletter, which is typically every other week or so. And we try really hard to keep our update stories under 500 words so that you can read them in 5 minutes or less. And we have our social media feeds as well for more regular updates, little shorter snippets.
Yeah. So on the flip side of all of that, right, at least in the Southwest region, we try to support and encourage people to give to Week of Compassion, but we've also been significantly the recipient of Week of Compassion care, both in Harvey relief, Hurricane Harvey that hit the coast of Texas in 2017, and then more recently in whatever we call this Snowmageddon ice storm, infrastructure near failure that covered most of the state of Texas in February. And so talk to us a little bit about the kinds of support that Week of Compassion gives in natural disasters like that to congregations and disciples.
Yeah. So as I said earlier, our sort of first avenue is actually prior to the disaster. So weekofcompassion.org/prepare, check out the resources for your congregations. Yeah. Once the event has happened, really our first task is pastoral, to work with the regional offices to see what the situation is on the ground for our disciples and for their surrounding communities. And I like to talk about providing support to and through disciple congregations. You are our first partners. So we have three kinds of grants that we do early on that we call solidarity grants. First are congregational solidarity grants when churches have sustained damage at their buildings. Second are household solidarity grants. If members, and we use that word really loosely, knowing that many of you have different ways of defining membership. When members of your congregations have had damage at their homes or other financial hardship because of the event. And then community solidarity grants. We know you're the first ones on the ground, often taking care of your neighbors, adapting the ministries of your church, your food pantries and your clothing pantries and all the other great work that you're doing to serve your neighbors. And we want to support and amplify that. So we have those grants. Then we invest pretty significantly in trying to share really good information and help people navigate systems. And if there's a FEMA declaration, what does that mean?
Right.
And what do we do now? And how do we help people apply? And that whole process. And then getting folks connected to the long-term recovery. There are some folks who will, be able to meet their needs fairly quickly, and a few weeks or months will pass and they'll pretty much be back on their feet. There are others for whom it will take years. So we're still really active with Hurricane Harvey, providing grant assistance and relational assistance for partners in Southeast Texas who are still doing home repair and crisis intervention with folks who have been still living in just really unacceptable conditions for our neighbors to be living in because they have not had access to resources to repair. So one project that I'm excited about, there's a project in Refugio County, and we connected through them through a whole network of partners, the long story, but they were helping to relocate a whole community, a historically Black and Brown community that was in the 100-year floodplain and had been flooded a bunch of times, and it was just not a good place for them to remain. It was really creating hardship for these families, but they didn't want to lose the community and the ties that they had. And so this whole community was picked up basically and relocated into a new kind of subdivision. And we helped to fill some gaps in funding to make that happen. You have to do a soil test in Texas before you can build, apparently. And so we helped to fund a soil test. Never something I would have anticipated, but our partners said, this is what we need to build these 20 houses. And they are going to be doing the dedication of the final 10 at the end of next month. So
wow, nice.
Yeah.
Very good. So both ends, disciples congregations and disciples in the Southwest region can support the work that you're doing, and also have been beneficiaries and can benefit preparation, solidarity grants in the moment, and then long-term recovery efforts. Part of that, Caroline, particularly with the multi-county disaster that we just went through in February, you and I have talked a little bit about disciples, leaders who will have their ear to the ground in their county and will be engaged in their county level recovery efforts. And that leads to kind of who you partner with beyond disciples, right? We joke about the alphabet soup among disciples of Christ, but you're my interpreter when it comes to the alphabet soup of FEMA and federal resources. So talk a little bit about what that looks like and just how a disciple congregation or pastor nonprofit could be engaged in these kinds of efforts going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the sort of FEMA and federal side, there's a piece of just accompanying people through the process. There's a lot of paperwork that has to be uploaded and labeled correctly to go through the FEMA application and then appeals process. And especially with an event like the February storm, with a significant number of folks who have some level of insurance, there's a whole other set of paperwork that has to happen, because you have to have all that insurance paperwork filed before FEMA can move forward with your claim. So there are going to be a lot of appeals and things happening. So churches and pastors can just help connect people to good information. We did a training with a handful of what we called navigators to get that introductory information of how to walk people through that process. And if any of you are interested, say something in the chat and I'll follow up with you, because we can do that training again. The other piece of that is connecting with these community-wide coalitions. And in some places, those are sort of grassroots. It's the ministerial alliance that takes the lead and everybody just kind of works through that, and it's not really a formal structure. And that works in some places. In other places, it's a more kind of coordinated effort through what's called a long-term recovery group or committee or organization. It doesn't really matter. It's the sort of table that includes nonprofit organizations, houses of worship, fraternal organizations, your Better Business Bureau, your kind of just community leaders, and hopefully some government folks represented there as well, so that from all the sectors of your community, you're looking at where are the pockets of need in our community, where folks are not going to recover by their own resources and connections, and what resources can we access and leverage to make sure that our most vulnerable neighbors are taken care of and the greatest number of folks in our community can reach a level of wholeness and recovery and new normal that's sustainable going forward. So I am tracking where those have formed along, Southeast Texas. We get hit with enough storms that we've got a lot of those organizations already established. In other places where it's been a while since you've had a disaster, that group may not exist yet. It may be sort of in formation. There are folks at FEMA that are tasked with kind of helping spur that along. There are folks from what's called Texas VOAD, which is Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, that help to coordinate some of that formation. And then some of it, is if you got a county judge who's really on the ball and helping up, tap the right people and bring people to the table. Or if your emergency manager is really great in pulling people together, sometimes they can spur that process along. In any case, I'm listening for where those groups are forming and always glad to get disciples connected in, because it's a good way for Week of Compassion to then have connection and be able to provide grants and occasionally volunteer assistance. But then it's also just a way to say, okay, we're a local congregation. We have people resources and informational resources and maybe ministerial resources that can be brought to bear as we're putting together all the pieces of recovery.
Right. And I think, as someone who doesn't deal with disaster all the time, one of the things you help me to do is to understand that this is so very contextual, and that, I'm looking for a one-stop shop for everybody in every county in Texas, New Mexico, and the Panhandle of Oklahoma. And it's the helping our leaders to know it's gonna look different. If you're in the Panhandle of Texas, it's gonna look different than if you're around Albuquerque. These are different places and going to respond differently. So along those lines,
my job would be easier, Andy.
What?
My job would be so much easier if it was a one-stop shop from county.
Yeah. But we could turn it over to someone less competent then, right? Yeah. So we need someone like you who really has the gift for understanding complexity and intricacy and the human dynamics. So grateful for you. So we're going to talk a little bit about just kind of that element of this. You've identified some FEMA resources that are available to people. And let me just say, back up and say as well, the Navigators program is something we're trying as the Christian Church in the Southwest, as a partnership with Week of Compassion, and really just because we know that there are some complex realities that people have to go through, we're beginning to recruit people who, unlike me, are not afraid of complexity and that can work through that. And that as we develop, may be able to walk alongside people filling out those forms. With the FEMA training that we did recently, I already heard from some of those navigators, but we had not started formally pairing them up with people who had needs. Just the fact that they had that information allowed them to help people at their local church or help them help people in their community to do that. And so I hope that we can begin to expand those list of people who've got their ear to the ground in their context, are talking to you fairly regularly, and listening to the guidance you give about navigating these. With this most recent ice storm, let's talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available. I've got a couple of handouts, but just as a way of also providing an example of the kinds of things that Week of Compassion can do to be helpful.
So specifically winter storm, or were you wanting to go COVID as well?
Wherever you feel like, but winter storm is what I've got queued up.
Sure. The main thing that's available right now is individual assistance, which has multiple branches. There's what most people are familiar with, which is the household assistance program, grants to help cover losses and repairs at primary homes. There's also direct housing assistance and other needs assistance, and there are intricacies of those programs. You can learn all about it at disasterassistance.gov, or I can point you to some other links if that's helpful. The main thing is that there is a deadline for application for households, and this is for homeowners and renters. There's assistance available in both categories. If you had damage and loss because of the storm, there is an application deadline of May 20th. It was April 20th and it has been extended. So you may have seen other paperwork, you may have seen other messaging that had that April date. That was correct until a week or so ago when we did receive an extension on that deadline, now May 20. Again, disasterassistance.gov. There's also a toll-free line that people can call if they don't have internet access or just prefer to talk to a person. It's usually a little slower to go that way, but it is available. And there is translation available on that helpline in a whole bunch of languages. Folks will need some documentation of their losses, and folks will need to have either a social security number or documentation that someone in the household is a citizen or a legal permanent resident, or the technical term of qualified alien. And if you are that, you know it. Those categories qualify you for federal assistance. On the COVID side, there's also a new program for funeral assistance. And that's one that I really want to push out to our congregations, because I know that our church leaders know the people who have had losses through this pandemic. And, oh, great. This is a new program that has just been launched within the past month, which provides reimbursement for funeral expenses for deaths that have been attributed to COVID. The deaths had to have happened in the United States between January 20th, 2020 and the current date, and that is ongoing until they shut the program down. The registrant must fall within those categories of legal permanent resident, citizen, or qualified alien, but the deceased does not have to have any particular documentation status, just the applicant. And you just have to have documentation that you incurred expenses that are not otherwise covered for this funeral. There are a whole list of qualified funeral expenses, interment and cremation and buying a coffin and hosting the service at the funeral home are all in that list. and it can't have been covered by, insurance, a life insurance policy, a prepaid funeral plan. It has to be an actual expense incurred by the applicant. That Andy was showing a flyer that we can link to, and
Yeah, yeah.
the FAQs page on the FEMA COVID-19 funeral assistance page is quite helpful, I think, and pretty clear. But certainly something that can be useful to your people. There is a cap per decedent, but not each applicant can apply for multiple people. If you incurred expenses from multiple funerals, first of all, God bless you. And I pray that you are getting the support you need as you're going through multiple losses. And we hope that this bit of financial assistance can be some of that support. There is a total cap per state where the deaths occurred. Very few people, I think, are going to hit those caps. And it's not dependent on income, is the other main piece that I want to get across, is that this is eligible to anybody. If you incurred expenses, that if the deceased's death certificate says, because of COVID-19, attributed to COVID-19, symptoms related to COVID-19, there's a whole set of phrases that will qualify it. There's a whole list of paperwork that people need to get together that's on that FEMA funeral assistance website. And all of those applications are happening through a helpline, a toll-free helpline that's designated just for this program.
Caroline, thank you so much for your time and energy. I think, again, this is just an example of why you want to stay connected to Week of Compassion. That's a lot of complex information, and you have this gift of staying up to date with what's out there, what's being offered, but also some real helpful overarching kinds of ways of, this is the way we approach a disaster, which, when you're in it, again, it's one of those things you don't have a roadmap. Caroline has the roadmap. She's got it looks like a roadmap, right? I know exactly what it looks like of how we process some of these things. And so helpful to establish good relationships with Week of Compassion, be tuned in to support the work, but also really be guided whenever those disaster strikes, to know who to reach out to. So my friend Ed Michael would always say to our folk, the dollar you give to Week of Compassion will go further than any dollar you give anywhere. And I absolutely believe that's true, that whenever disaster strikes, your impulse to give should be directed to Week of Compassion first. But what I have learned in the last 3.5 years is, when disaster strikes you, Week of Compassion is also the first place you can turn for help and support. So thank you for helping us both with some specific information related to COVID relief and ice storm relief that we're still working through. Some reminders that we do this in partnership with your regional minister. Wherever you are, right, and there may be some folks that are outside the Southwest region listening to this, that when disaster strikes there, that there are ways to contact Week of Compassion directly, but it's always good as well to reach out to your regional ministry first and let us participate. We are regional ministers are partners and conduits to these kinds of resources whenever you need them. So thank you so much. Is there anything we need to cover before you say goodbye? We appreciate all the ground you've covered quickly. So.
Yeah. I always tend to focus more on the domestic disaster piece because that's where my whole head is most of the time.
Yeah.
Week of Compassion does have some other priorities for the year, because we do cover relief, refugee, and development work as part of our witness. And so we have committed to working with our international partners for fair distribution of vaccines, knowing that this global pandemic is causing significant impact across around the world, and some of the communities that were most vulnerable to begin with will have the hardest time accessing vaccines and reaching a new normal coming out of this pandemic. So fair distribution of vaccines is one priority. Ending gender-based violence and supporting women's empowerment through girls' education, through sustainable economic models, through support for women's education and skills development is another priority for us, especially as we have seen gains of the past many years sliding through this pandemic. We are focused with our partners on trying to prevent further backsliding and support women and girls as we come forward from this pandemic. And similarly, to protect the rights of refugees and migrants who are in incredibly vulnerable positions and have also been significantly impacted by this pandemic. So wanted to name those priorities and lift up that we are a wide ministry with a breadth of emphasis. And like I said, more information on the website.
Yes, yeah, right. I mean, absolutely, so much, so important. So the executive director for Week of Compassion is V. Nguyen, so when we talk about V, I think I just said his name and I didn't clarify who I was talking about. So who else works? Week of Compassion is a pretty slim operation. And one of the things that again, my friend Ed Michael, I want to give him credit where credit is due, that part of the reason we get to say so much good about the stewardship of Week of Compassion is that the overhead and administrative costs at Week of Compassion is not, I mean, it's less than other nonprofit organizations because you all don't have just a huge staff. So in addition to V, who is also a product of PCU, grew up at East Dallas Christian Church and then got his MDiv at, I don't know, I think University of Cleveland or Cincinnati, it's Chicago, University of Chicago, some cold place.
Yes, be our executive director. I'm full-time, and then we have a full-time communications and development manager, Aaron Wathen, the Reverend Aaron Wathen, who is in Kentucky, and V is out in California. So we've got a nice geographic spread with our full-time staff. And then we have a fabulous part-time administrative assistant, Susie McKay, who normally works out of the Disciple Center, although for the past 14 months, not so much.
Indianapolis, very good. Caroline, thank you so much for giving us of your time and energy. We will have this available to, we're gonna archive and push out our Disciples Connect conversations from our YouTube channel. So if you are watching in that format, please subscribe. If we get enough subscriptions, we get to do some other cool things with our channel. And so, like I said, our goal here is primarily to introduce the things that we often take for granted. The disciples do good work in so many different ways. So grateful for you. But as I said with our foundation, we did the first of these was Christian Church Foundation. I reminded people frequently that when you deal with Bobby Holly, when you deal with Marilyn Fidmont, you're dealing with ordained clergy and people who approach our concerns first as ministry and second as a financial reality. And as well, you are ordained, V is ordained, Aaron is ordained. And so when you're dealing Week of Compassion folk, you're dealing with people who are ministers first and disaster relief or international organizers, whatever, as a part of that call, an intricate part of that call, but certainly the commitment to the work of God is primary. So thank you for what you're doing. In that vein, would it be okay if I offered a prayer for you and for Week of Compassion as we conclude our time together?
Please.
Lord, we are grateful for the chance to be together as church. We know that 80 years ago, you inspired disciples to think outside of their own little world and reach out across the ocean to help the efforts to rebuild after a catastrophic world war. In that vein, oh God, for all of this time, you have been inspiring disciples to reach out from their doorsteps to the ends of the earth. We thank you for the ways in which that is manifest now in the Week of Compassion ministry. We thank you for V and for Caroline and for Aaron. We thank you for their administrative assistant. We thank you for all those who give the Week of Compassion, for the work that is done through Disciples Volunteering and partnerships with Disciples Home Missions and regional ministries and overseas ministries, and all of the ways in which our services are interconnected and combined. So make us faithful, O God, to the work that you've called us to do, and may all that we do and say glorify you. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
I forgot your administrative assistant's name. I apologize. This day after Administrative Assistance Day, and so
Susie McKay.
God knew who I was talking about. So let me conclude the broadcast first